The law said an alien could be owned, but the moment Ethan Carter saw her eyes, he realized the law had never met a human conscience. The trade station of Port Meridian floated above a pale desert world, its metal rings humming softly as cargo haulers drifted through docking lanes like slow migrating whales, and inside the central commerce hall the air carried the mixed scent of warm circuitry, recycled oxygen, and sweet synthetic drinks sold at glowing kiosks along the walls. Ethan Carter stood near the back of the chamber with a canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder, a 6'2" freight mechanic in worn boots who had only come to the station to buy a replacement plasma regulator for a cargo ship that refused to behave, but the crowd gathered beneath the bright auction lights made him pause, because auctions in frontier stations usually meant rare minerals, abandoned starships, or surplus robots, not the quiet figure standing alone on the raised platform. She looked almost human at first glance. A slender alien girl wrapped in a simple gray transit cloak, her skin a soft shade of blue that shimmered faintly under the white lights, and her dark silver hair falling loosely over her shoulders as a small translator band rested at her collarbone, and above the platform a floating display projected the official notice in several languages: refugee transfer under interstellar debt law, a regulation Ethan had heard about but never expected to see in person. The announcer spoke in a calm administrative voice that sounded more like someone explaining shipping fees than someone presenting a living being. Describing her species as Ilari, displaced during a border conflict, legally classified as indentured property until purchased by a registered citizen who would assume responsibility for her housing, transport, and work status, and as the crowd murmured with curiosity, Ethan noticed something the announcer clearly did not understand. Because the alien girl was not looking at the buyers with anger or fear but with a quiet exhaustion, the expression of someone who had already imagined every possible outcome and found none of them hopeful. A trader near the front folded his arms and shook his head, muttering that Ilari refugees were more trouble than profit, while another spectator laughed softly and suggested she would probably be resold by morning, and Ethan felt a strange tightening in his chest because none of them were speaking to her. They were speaking about her the way dockworkers talked about cargo weight or fuel costs. The announcer called for offers, the lights reflecting in the polished floor as the number flickered above the platform, but no one raised a hand at first. And the silence stretched long enough that Ethan almost turned away to continue his errand until the alien girl finally lifted her gaze toward the crowd, and for a brief second her eyes met his across the distance of the hall, calm but tired, steady but carrying a question she did not bother asking anymore. Ethan had spent most of his life fixing machines that other people considered disposable, engines written off as junk until someone patient enough listened to the sound they made, and something about that look felt painfully familiar. Like a quiet signal buried under noise, the announcer began lowering the starting price as procedure required, already preparing to close the listing and move on to the next item, and Ethan shifted his weight, glancing down at the credit tablet in his hand, reminding himself he had come here for a part that cost barely a fraction of the number glowing above the platform, yet his feet did not move toward the supply counters. Because somewhere between the humming lights and the silent figure standing alone under them, Ethan Carter realized the law might say she was property, but every instinct he trusted said she was simply someone who had run out of luck in a very large galaxy. The number above the platform dropped again with a soft electronic chime, and the murmurs in the auction hall grew thinner, the way sound fades in a room when people begin losing interest, and Ethan Carter realized with a strange sense of clarity that the moment was about to pass without anyone doing anything at all. The announcer adjusted the small microphone near his collar and repeated the legal statement with professional patience, explaining that under the Interstellar Debt Resolution Act, the Ilari refugee would remain listed until a registered citizen assumed contractual guardianship. Otherwise the listing would be transferred to labor distribution on the outer colonies where few buyers bothered to ask questions, and the alien girl remained perfectly still on the platform as if she had already heard that outcome 100 times before. Ethan shifted his grip on the tablet in his hand and glanced around the chamber again, hoping someone else might suddenly step forward, perhaps a merchant with more credits than conscience or a humanitarian organization looking for a symbolic gesture, but the spectators were already turning away, drifting back toward food vendors and cargo kiosks while the bright lights above the platform reflected in the polished metal floor. The mechanic in Ethan kept telling him that none of this had anything to do with him. Because he had a ship waiting in docking ring 4 and a regulator valve that would not install itself, yet another part of him remembered long nights drifting through asteroid salvage zones where abandoned machines still hummed with faint energy, machines people said were worthless until someone stubborn enough gave them attention. The announcer lowered the number again and the digital board flickered as if it was growing impatient with the room, and Ethan noticed the alien girl finally blink. Once, slowly, her eyes shifting away from the crowd toward the floor as though she had quietly accepted that this chapter of her life would end exactly the way the law predicted. Something about that calm resignation unsettled him more than anger ever could, because anger meant a person still believed something might change. He exhaled slowly and stepped forward before he could talk himself out of it, the heel of his boot echoing once against the floor as he raised his tablet and the small sensor light turned green with a soft confirming tone. The announcer paused mid-sentence and glanced toward him, clearly surprised that someone had finally signaled a bid, and several people nearby turned their heads with mild curiosity the way travelers watch someone choose the last seat on a crowded shuttle. Ethan did not feel heroic or dramatic, he mostly felt like a mechanic who had just decided to buy a tool nobody else wanted, and he kept his voice calm when the announcer asked for confirmation of the registered citizen identification attached to the signal. The system projected Ethan Carter across the display board along with a simple line of data that identified him as a licensed cargo engineer with no criminal flags and a modest but stable credit history, and the crowd reacted with a few quiet chuckles because nothing about that profile suggested a wealthy collector or a powerful official. The announcer cleared his throat politely and finalized the transaction with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that had probably processed 1,000 stranger deals across the frontier, and a moment later the glowing number above the platform vanished as the system transferred ownership status into Ethan's registry account. The alien girl looked up again then, not dramatically, and not with sudden gratitude, just with a subtle shift of attention that suggested she was trying to understand why a tall human mechanic standing 30 feet away had changed the direction of her life with a single quiet signal, and Ethan suddenly became very aware that he had just spent far more credits than a plasma regulator cost, yet when their eyes met again across the bright auction lights he felt something else settle into place. A quiet certainty that sometimes the most complicated decision in the galaxy began with a simple thought that refused to leave you alone. The administrative chime that confirmed the transaction faded into the background noise of the auction hall as the platform lights dimmed slightly, and for a moment neither Ethan Carter nor the Ilari girl moved because the strange silence that follows a finished deal settled between them like dust in a sunbeam. The announcer completed a few routine confirmations with quiet efficiency while a small service drone floated toward the platform carrying a handheld registry scanner and a thin metallic bracelet designed to track indentured transfers during the first 72 hours after purchase, a procedure that the law described as standard verification rather than restraint, though the word verification did not make the device look any less cold under the bright station lights. Ethan walked forward through the dispersing crowd with the steady pace of someone who had spent half his life crossing cargo bays filled with humming machines, and as he approached the platform he noticed that the alien girl had straightened slightly, not in defiance but in preparation, the posture of someone expecting the next instruction in a chain of events she no longer tried to control. Up close the faint blue tone of her skin carried a soft iridescent sheen like light reflecting off deep water, and the translator band resting against her collarbone emitted a quiet pulse as the station system updated her ownership record. The service drone extended the bracelet toward Ethan and displayed the legal prompt in several languages explaining that the registered guardian must attach the device to the transferred individual until departure from the station, and Ethan hesitated just long enough for the drone to repeat the instruction in a politely neutral tone that sounded almost patient. The alien girl extended her wrist automatically, her expression calm but distant as though this moment had already happened many times in different forms across different places, yet Ethan felt that same quiet resistance stirring again inside his chest because every instinct he trusted told him that beginning their acquaintance with another piece of metal was the wrong kind of first step. He cleared his throat and asked the drone if the verification could be linked directly to his citizen identification instead, explaining that the law required location accountability but did not specify that the individual must carry the transmitter personally, and the drone paused for half a second while its processor searched the legal registry before confirming that such a configuration was technically acceptable if the registered guardian accepted full responsibility for movement within the station. Ethan nodded and tapped his wrist tablet to authorize the change, and the bracelet retracted back into the drone with a soft click before it floated away to its next task. The alien girl lowered her arms slowly as if she needed a moment to understand what had just happened, and when she looked at Ethan again the exhaustion in her eyes had shifted slightly into something more complicated, a quiet uncertainty that had not been there before. He rubbed the back of his neck in a gesture that felt awkward under the bright lights and offered a small, careful smile that belonged more to a tired mechanic than to someone who had just altered another person's future. The translator band flickered once and her voice came through with a soft, steady tone that carried the faint musical rhythm of a language far older than the trade station itself as she asked why he had done that when the law clearly allowed the device. Ethan considered the question for a moment, glancing around the busy hall where merchants were already negotiating new shipments and travelers hurried past glowing direction panels, and finally he answered with simple honesty that he had never liked starting any partnership by locking something around someone's wrist, especially when the law already trusted him to be responsible. The alien girl studied his face for several seconds as if measuring the weight of those words, and then she gave the smallest nod he had ever seen, not a gesture of gratitude but something quieter, the first fragile signal that perhaps the future waiting beyond the station doors might not look exactly the way she had expected only minutes earlier. The bright commerce hall slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the transaction closed, voices blending with the low hum of ventilation ducts and the distant whir of cargo lifts moving several tons of freight through the station's circular corridors. And Ethan Carter gestured lightly toward the exit walkway that led away from the auction platform because standing under the lights while curious spectators continued to glance at them was beginning to feel unnecessarily dramatic. The Ilari girl stepped down from the platform with careful balance, her boots making a soft contact against the polished metal floor as if she was adjusting to the simple freedom of moving without instructions being shouted from a loudspeaker above her head, and the translator band at her collarbone emitted a faint tone while it synchronized with the station's general language grid. Ethan walked beside her at an easy pace toward the wide corridor that curved along the outer ring of Port Meridian, a corridor lined with tall windows where the blackness of space stretched beyond the glass like an ocean without a horizon and the pale desert planet below rotated slowly in silence. For several moments neither of them spoke, partly because the noise of the hall faded behind them and partly because Ethan sensed that too many questions at once would feel like another kind of pressure. The air along the corridor smelled faintly of coolant and fresh polymer from a nearby repair shop, and a cargo loader rolled past carrying stacked crates marked with shipping codes that glowed orange under the overhead lights. The alien girl glanced around quietly, studying the movement of travelers, the floating advertisement panels, the security drones drifting near the ceiling, and there was a cautious curiosity in the way her eyes followed everything as if she had not expected to see the station from this side of the transaction. After they walked about 30 feet Ethan finally cleared his throat and spoke in a calm voice that carried the relaxed rhythm of someone used to explaining things to new crew members on long freight runs, telling her that his ship was docked in Ring 4 and that he needed one replacement part before leaving orbit later that evening, and that meant they would probably walk through 2 more corridors and 1 cargo lift before reaching the supply hangar. The translator band pulsed once before her reply came through in steady English, asking whether he always explained his plans so openly to someone he had only met a few minutes earlier. Ethan smiled faintly at that and admitted that he did, mostly because surprises made people nervous and he had discovered that nervous passengers tended to break things aboard a working ship. She considered that answer for a moment while they approached a large observation window that stretched nearly 15 feet across the wall, revealing a line of cargo vessels gliding slowly toward docking arms that extended like mechanical branches from the station ring. The blue glow of distant engines reflected across her iridescent skin as she paused beside the glass, and Ethan noticed that she was watching the ships with a look he recognized from many young crew members seeing open space for the first time, a mixture of caution and quiet wonder. After a few seconds she asked another question, this time softer, asking why he had truly purchased her when the other buyers clearly had not wanted the responsibility. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the window and followed her gaze out toward the drifting ships while he thought about the simplest answer that would still be honest, and finally he said that sometimes a person sees a situation that feels wrong in a way that sticks in the back of the mind like a loose bolt rattling inside an engine, and the longer you ignore it the louder it becomes until the only practical solution is to stop and fix it. The translator band carried his words across the quiet corridor, and the alien girl looked at him again with that same thoughtful expression that had appeared on the auction platform earlier. except this time there was a small new detail in her eyes that had not existed before, a cautious spark of curiosity that suggested she was beginning to suspect that the human standing beside her might not treat the law of ownership the same way the rest of the galaxy did. The corridor curved gently toward the inner transit ring where the traffic of Port Meridian became denser, and the soft vibration beneath Ethan Carter's boots changed pitch as the floor panels carried the distant resonance of cargo lifts moving through the structure like slow mechanical heartbeats. Ahead of them a wide junction opened into a supply concourse filled with repair kiosks, fuel vendors, and bright stacks of equipment crates labeled in half a dozen trade languages, the air carrying. The mixed scent of lubricants, warm electronics, and something faintly sweet from a food stall where travelers gathered around steaming containers. Ethan slowed his pace slightly so the Ilari girl could keep beside him without feeling hurried, and he noticed the way her gaze moved carefully across the corridor, observing everything with quiet attention as if every detail might matter later. The translator band at her collarbone flickered once before she spoke again, her voice calm but thoughtful as she asked whether his ship required her labor to repay the credits he had spent, because according to the law that was the usual arrangement in such transactions. Ethan gave a small exhale that almost turned into a quiet laugh and shook his head gently while they stepped aside to allow a cargo trolley carrying several large containers to roll past, its wheels humming across the metal floor. He explained that the law might describe ownership and repayment in tidy paragraphs, but he had purchased exactly one thing from that platform, and it was not a person, it was the right to remove someone from a situation that felt wrong. And once that job was finished the rest could be discussed like two reasonable travelers deciding where to go next. The alien girl looked at him with a careful expression that suggested she was examining each word for hidden meaning, perhaps expecting a condition to appear at the end of the sentence, yet none arrived. They reached the entrance to the supply hangar where tall racks of mechanical components rose nearly 20 feet toward the ceiling, and a soft yellow light illuminated rows of sealed containers that held everything from thruster couplings to plasma regulators. Ethan approached a service terminal mounted beside the entrance and tapped the screen until the system displayed the part number he needed, and while the automated arm inside the rack began retrieving the small metal cylinder he glanced back toward his unexpected companion. She had stopped near a stack of shipping crates marked with distance warnings and was studying a simple maintenance drone that hovered nearby performing a routine scan across a panel of exposed wiring. There was a quiet focus in her posture now, not the distant stillness she had shown earlier on the platform but the curiosity of someone slowly remembering that the world still contained things worth examining. Ethan collected the regulator when the machine placed it on the counter with a soft metallic click and slid the part into the canvas tool bag over his shoulder before stepping back toward her. For a moment they simply stood beside the hovering drone while its sensors flickered blue across the wall panel, and then he asked her name because it occurred to him that he had just spent several thousand credits on someone whose identity he had never properly heard. The translator band pulsed again and she answered with quiet clarity that her name was Lyra, a name that carried the soft musical tone of distant stars when spoken aloud. Ethan nodded once as if testing the sound of it and introduced himself in return, and something about the exchange felt oddly important despite its simplicity, because in a station where laws and transactions had reduced their meeting to a line in a registry database, the act of sharing names quietly returned them both to something much older and far more human than ownership. The supply hangar gradually faded behind them as Ethan Carter and Lyra stepped back into the curved transit corridor that connected the station's inner commercial ring with the outer docking sectors, and the steady background noise of Port Meridian wrapped around them again like the quiet mechanical breathing of a city built entirely from metal and light. Ethan adjusted the canvas tool bag on his shoulder where the newly purchased regulator rested beside a handful of smaller instruments, and he gestured toward a wide directional panel mounted along the wall that displayed glowing arrows pointing toward docking ring 4 nearly 600 feet farther along the corridor. Lyra walked beside him with a measured pace, the faint iridescent sheen of her blue skin catching the overhead lights as travelers moved past in both directions, some glancing at them briefly and others too busy with cargo carts and navigation tablets to notice anything unusual at all. For several moments neither of them spoke. Yet the silence felt different from the earlier quiet inside the auction hall because this time it carried a sense of movement and possibility rather than resignation. Eventually Lyra looked toward the long corridor stretching ahead and asked in a thoughtful voice whether Ethan always traveled alone across the trade routes. Because she had not seen any crew members waiting for him in the supply hangar, Ethan smiled slightly at the question and admitted that the cargo hauler he operated technically belonged to a small independent shipping company, but the actual work was often done by one person with enough patience to repair engines and enough stubbornness to keep old vessels moving through space long after larger corporations considered them obsolete. He explained that the ship was not large by interstellar standards, about 200 feet from bow to stern, with a cargo bay that could hold several dozen freight containers, but it was reliable in the way older machines sometimes were, provided someone listened carefully to every vibration and rattle inside the hull. Lyra absorbed that description quietly while they passed another observation window where the dark curve of the desert planet below filled half the sky, and the reflection of distant thrusters painted slow streaks of light across the glass. After a moment she asked a question that carried a subtle hesitation beneath the translator's smooth voice, wondering where Ethan expected her to go once they departed the station because the legal registry now identified her as part of his travel record. Ethan stopped walking for a second beside the window and considered the question while watching a cargo shuttle glide toward a docking arm several hundred yards away, its navigation lights blinking calmly in the endless dark. Finally he answered with the same straightforward tone he used when explaining mechanical problems to new apprentices, saying that the first destination would simply be a quiet place where neither of them needed to think about auction platforms or legal ownership codes, and after that they could decide together what direction made the most sense. Lyra studied his expression carefully as if searching for the invisible boundaries that usually accompany promises like that, but his face carried only the calm patience of a mechanic who had spent years solving problems one step at a time. They resumed walking down the corridor toward the outer ring where the lighting gradually shifted from bright commercial white to the cooler blue tones used in the docking sectors, and the low hum of starship engines became faintly audible through the station structure. Lyra glanced ahead toward the distant docking gates and then back toward Ethan with a quiet curiosity that had grown stronger with every passing minute, because in a galaxy governed by contracts and ownership codes she had expected the human who purchased her to behave like a warden or a master. Yet instead she was beginning to suspect that Ethan Carter might be something far more confusing and far more rare, a person who treated freedom not as a reward granted by power but as a simple starting point for everything that followed. The lighting along Docking Ring 4 glowed a cooler shade of blue than the commercial corridors behind them, and the steady vibration beneath the floor panels carried the unmistakable rhythm of idling starship engines preparing for departure, a sound Ethan Carter had learned to recognize the way a sailor recognizes the tide. Large bay doors stretched nearly 40 feet high along the curved wall, each marked with bright alphanumeric codes, while small cargo vehicles rolled past hauling containers toward open hangars where crews worked under suspended maintenance lights. Ethan slowed his pace as they approached one particular docking gate labeled R4-17, and beyond the transparent security barrier Lyra could see a medium-sized freight vessel resting quietly within the bay, its hull painted a practical matte gray that bore the faded marks of long service routes across different star systems. The ship was not elegant like the sleek diplomatic cruisers that sometimes visited major worlds, but there was a quiet sturdiness in the thick landing struts and reinforced cargo doors that suggested it had survived years of difficult journeys. Ethan placed his palm against the access panel beside the gate and the scanner emitted a brief green glow before the barrier slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, revealing the interior ramp leading up into the vessel. He gestured toward the ship with a relaxed motion and explained that she was called the Quiet Harbor, a name that had sounded almost poetic to him the first time he had seen it painted across the hull years ago when the previous owner retired from the shipping routes and sold the vessel to someone willing to keep her flying. Lyra stepped slowly onto the ramp and glanced up along the length of the cargo hauler while the distant lights of Port Meridian reflected faintly across the metal surface, and there was something thoughtful in the way she observed the ship, as if measuring the difference between this quiet machine and the uncertain path she had expected to follow only an hour earlier. Inside the cargo bay the air smelled faintly of warm circuitry and engine coolant, and the wide interior space held several secured freight containers stacked neatly along one wall while the opposite side remained open for the next delivery. Ethan set his tool bag on a nearby crate and opened a small maintenance panel mounted along the bulkhead, revealing the regulator housing that had been causing problems during the last trip between stations. He worked with calm efficiency, loosening 2 bolts and sliding the damaged component free before installing the new part he had purchased in the supply hangar. Lyra stood a few feet away watching the process with quiet interest, noticing how the human mechanic moved with the steady confidence of someone who understood every vibration and sound inside the vessel. after a moment she asked whether he trusted such an old ship to carry them safely across space, because the scars along the hull suggested it had endured many difficult journeys. Ethan tightened the final bolt and wiped his hands on a small cloth. Before answering that a well-cared-for machine was often more reliable than a brand new one, because every weak point had already revealed itself over time and someone patient had repaired it, he closed the panel and the engine systems responded with a low steady hum that traveled through the floor beneath their feet like the quiet heartbeat of the vessel waking from sleep. Lyra listened to the sound and then looked toward the open ramp where the lights of the station corridor still glowed. Outside, and for a brief moment the choice in front of her became very clear because nothing in the docking bay prevented her from turning around and walking back toward the crowded corridors of Port Meridian, yet she remained standing beside Ethan Carter inside the cargo hold of a ship called the Quiet Harbor, watching the engines awaken while a new possibility slowly unfolded. In the silent space between two travelers who had only met an hour ago but were already beginning to share the same uncertain road among the stars. The cargo bay of the Quiet Harbor settled into a calm mechanical rhythm as the new regulator synchronized with the engine core, and a gentle vibration spread through the deck plates beneath Ethan Carter's boots like the steady breathing of a machine finally satisfied with its repairs. Overhead lights warmed slightly as the ship's systems finished their checks, casting long reflections across the metallic floor while the distant glow of Port Meridian still shimmered beyond the open ramp. Ethan stepped toward a control panel mounted beside the inner bulkhead and ran through the standard departure sequence with practiced patience, confirming navigation clearance, engine temperature, and cargo locks, the kind of quiet routine that had guided him through hundreds of departures from stations that looked different but always sounded the same. Lyra remained near the edge of the cargo bay for a moment, her gaze drifting back toward the corridor outside where travelers moved through the docking ring beneath soft blue lights, and she realized with quiet clarity that if she stepped down that ramp now the station would simply absorb her again into its endless flow of strangers. The law might still recognize her status for several days until the registry expired, but the physical barrier between captivity and choice was only a few yards of metal walkway. She studied that open path while the ship's engines hummed deeper beneath her feet, and the translator band at her collarbone flickered faintly as if sensing the silent debate unfolding in her thoughts. Ethan noticed the direction of her gaze but did not interrupt the moment, because something in his instincts told him that the most important decision she would make today was not the one recorded in the station database but the one she made for herself without pressure or instruction. He finished entering the final coordinates for a short orbital departure and then leaned casually against the console, giving her the same quiet space he would give a new crew member standing at the threshold of their first voyage. After several seconds Lyra turned back toward him with a thoughtful expression that carried both caution and curiosity, and she asked a question that seemed to weigh more than the simple words suggested, wondering whether he expected her to remain aboard his vessel because the registry described her as part of his travel manifest. Ethan folded his arms loosely and answered with the straightforward honesty that had guided him through most of his life, explaining that the registry was only paperwork written by people who preferred neat categories, while real decisions belonged to the individual standing in the room. He gestured toward the ramp and told her that if she wished to return to the station corridors she was completely free to do so, and he would simply notify the system that the passenger listed on his record had chosen another destination. The cargo bay grew very quiet after that, the only sound the gentle resonance of the engines and the distant echo of docking traffic beyond the open hatch. Lyra listened to those words carefully, her eyes moving once more toward the bright lights of Port Meridian outside and then back toward the calm human mechanic who had purchased her freedom without ever asking for control. Slowly she stepped away from the ramp and walked farther into the cargo bay until the station corridor disappeared from view behind the bulkhead, and something subtle changed in the atmosphere of the ship at that moment, not because a contract required it but because a decision had finally been made. Ethan pushed himself away from the console and reached for the ramp control switch with a small nod that carried quiet respect rather than triumph, and as the heavy metal door began to close with a smooth mechanical glide, Lyra realized that for the first time since the law had placed a price on her existence she was not being transported somewhere by force or obligation but was simply choosing to travel forward beside someone who believed that freedom should always begin with a choice. The ramp of the Quiet Harbor sealed completely with a soft metallic thud, and for a moment the cargo bay became a quiet world of its own, separated from the noise and restless motion of Port Meridian outside. the engine hum deepened slightly as Ethan Carter moved to the flight console along the forward wall and confirmed the final departure clearance with the station traffic system, his fingers moving across the controls with the relaxed precision of someone who had performed the same routine more times than he could easily remember. Above them the ship's internal lights shifted to a steady navigation glow while the hull vibrated gently as the landing clamps released one by one, each disengagement sounding like a distant mechanical breath. Lyra stood near the center of the cargo bay and felt the subtle change in gravity as the vessel began to lift from the docking platform, and through a narrow observation panel she watched the familiar lights of the station slowly drift downward until the wide circular structure of Port Meridian filled the view like a shining ring suspended against the black canvas of space. She had expected to feel fear when the moment finally arrived, because every journey in her recent past had carried the weight of obligation or command, yet the emotion rising quietly inside her chest felt different, lighter, as if the simple act of choosing to remain aboard had loosened a chain she had carried without noticing. Ethan finished aligning the ship with the departure corridor and guided the freighter forward with smooth confidence, allowing the automated thrusters to carry them beyond the station perimeter before engaging the main drive. The deep blue glow of the engine spread across the hull and the starfield outside the observation panel slowly widened as the ship slipped into open space. After several seconds he turned away from the controls and walked back into the cargo bay where Lyra was still watching the shrinking lights of the station behind them. He stopped a few feet away and leaned casually against a cargo container while the quiet pulse of the engines echoed through the deck beneath them. For a moment neither of them spoke because the silence felt comfortable, the kind that does not demand explanation. Eventually Lyra looked toward him with a thoughtful expression and asked a question that had been waiting quietly since the auction platform earlier that day, wondering what he intended to do now that the legal registry would still list her as his responsibility for the next several weeks. Ethan considered the question with the same steady calm he used when diagnosing an unfamiliar engine problem, and then he answered that responsibility did not always mean control. Sometimes it simply meant making sure someone had the chance to stand on their own feet again. He explained that the next stop would be a small agricultural world about 2 light-years away where the local port authorities rarely cared about interstellar paperwork as long as travelers behaved honestly, and there she could decide what kind of life she wanted to build without a price tag attached to her name. Lyra listened carefully while the faint light of distant stars reflected across her iridescent blue skin, and something warm appeared in her eyes that had not existed when they first met beneath the auction lights. She stepped closer to the observation panel and watched the vast galaxy unfold before them, realizing that the path ahead was no longer a corridor built by laws and transactions but a horizon shaped by possibility. Ethan followed her gaze toward the scattered stars and allowed himself a quiet smile because in all his years repairing engines and hauling cargo between distant systems he had learned one simple truth about the universe. Sometimes the smallest decision made by an ordinary